Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over chapters 3 and 4 of J.D. Salinger's classic, The Catcher in the Rye. So, let's see what Holden's up to after he meets old Spencer, shall we? Alright, let's dive in to chapter 3. Chapter 3 starts out with Holden telling the reader that he is a terrific liar. He says that he's so good at lying that even if he were to buy a magazine and someone asked him where he was going, he'd be able to lie and say the opera or somewhere else. He then tells the reader that what he told old Spencer about going and getting his equipment from the gym was a sheer lie. He then tells the reader that he lives in the Ausenberg Memorial dorms at Pensy. He said this dorm was specifically for juniors and seniors and that he was a junior, and that his roommate was a senior. He then gives a little bit of history about the Ausenberger, and that Ausenberger went to Pensy as a child, made a lot of money, and then donated it back to the school, so they dedicated a dorm to him. Holden says that Ausenberger made his money from burials, and that supposedly people who paid him, he would bury them at the school in a special place. Holden doesn't really believe this, and he thinks the guy pretty much just takes the money and runs. But Holden tells the reader that Ausenberg actually came to the school one day for the first football game. He said that all the boys had to go outside as he drove up in his big car to the school and cheer for him. Then, that day while everybody was at chapel, Ausenberger gave what felt like a 10-hour speech about his life, what a great guy he was, and his relationship with God. Holden said that he didn't really care for the speech that much, but the best part about it was the fact that during the middle of the speech, one of his classmates, Edgar Marsala, let out a huge fart, and all the boys were desperately trying not to laugh. And what made it funnier was the fact that the headmaster was sitting right next to Edgar, and Holden could tell that he wasn't amused at all. Holden goes on to say that the next day, while everybody was in study hall, the headmaster made a big speech about how the boy who let out a fart shouldn't be allowed to stay at Pensy for his actions. And during this, the boys tried to get Edgar to let out another fart, but he wasn't able to. After this, Holden tells the reader that he was in the dorm room and he's making himself comfortable and pulls out a book that he's reading from the library. He tells us this book is called Out of Africa by Isaac Denison. He goes on to tell the reader that he was very illiterate, but he did read a lot. He also tells us that his favorite author is his brother D.B. And then after that, it's Ring Lardner. He also tells us that he prefers comedies or plays, but he also reads a whole bunch of different types of literature. He said one of his favorite stories was about a cop who fell in love with a woman who was always speeding, but the cop was married, so he couldn't go after her, and she ends up dying because she speeds. Holden says that the best type of books are ones that you wish you were friends with the author and could call them up after reading their stories and talk about what you read. Sadly, some of his favorite authors were already dead, so he wasn't able to do that. He also tells us about the hat that he bought that morning in New York City. It was a red hunting hat, and he liked how it looked on him. He also then tells that in the dorm rooms there are 2 chairs, one for each student, and how they're pretty worn out, but also pretty comfortable. So he goes to sit in one of them to read. He also tells the reader that his roommate was a guy named Stradlater. As Holden is sitting in the chair opening Out of Africa, he can hear the shower that separates his room from the other room go off. And he knew exactly who it was in the shower. And his name was Robert Ackley. Holden then goes on to describe Ackley and how he was over 6 foot, a senior, he was 18 and he wouldn't let you forget about it, and also he hated being called kid, which Holden did to him all the time. Also, Ackley had terrible sense of hygiene. His teeth were green and looked like moss, and his ears were also very dirty. He also says that Ackley necessarily wasn't the nicest guy, and that he always would come into Holden's room when his roommate wasn't there because Ackley didn't like Stradlater. Holden knew that he wasn't going to be able to continue reading with Ackley being in the room because he was going to try and force Holden into a conversation, and Holden could sense Ackley in the room with him. Holden goes on to say Ackley is the kind of guy who will pick up personal items at random off of your desk or dresser, ask what they are, and then put them back in a different spot. This really annoys Holden, but he knows he can't really do anything about it or try to stop him. When Ackley first enters the room, Holden pretends that he's still reading to try and get the conversation away, but to no avail. Ackley asks about a picture that Holden has on his dresser of a girl, and Holden says that he used to go out with this girl named Sally Hayes, and that's who the photo's of. He then asks Holden about the game and if Pensy won, but Holden says no and tells him the story about how he was in New York and lost all of the equipment for the fencing team, which really delights Ackley. and Ackley teases Holden about it. Then, Ackley asks Holden about the hunting hat, and Holden says he got it in New York for $1, to which Ackley said, "Wow, they really did scam you on that, didn't they?" Ackley goes on to say that the hat that Holden is wearing is one that he actually wears up north for hunting deer, and Holden says this isn't a deer hunting hat, it's a people hunting hat. Ackley then picks up Stradlater's knee supporter and asks whose is it, and when Holden tells him whose it is, he throws it on the bed. After this, Ackley then asks if Holden has talked to his parents yet about him flunking out of school, to which Holden says no, he hasn't told him yet. Holden also mentions that Ackley asks him where Stradlater is at, to which Holden tells him, I don't know, probably at the game, at a date. Holden found this very interesting, that though Ackley didn't like Stradlater, he was always asking where he was at. After this, Ackley then asks Holden if he has any scissors, because he has a few fingernails that he would like to cut. Holden tells him that he's already packed everything away and that it's in the closet, and that he's not going in to get them. However, Ackley demands them, and Holden gives in, goes over and gets them. But when Holden does try to get them, Stradlater's tennis racket hits him in the head, and Ackley laughs at this. Once Holden has gotten the fingernail clippers, he gives them to Ackley and asks if he could please cut his nails over a desk, because he doesn't want to step on the toenails or fingernail trimmings, but Ackley starts cutting them on the floor. Holden then chastises Ackley again and again, and finally Ackley cuts his nails over the table. Holden then says that the only reason Ackley does not like Stradlater is because Stradlater mentioned Ackley's teeth and told him quite a few times that he would feel better and look better if he kept them brushed and cleaned. Ackley tried to cut Holden off and say something, but Holden stands firm and says Stradlater was actually a really good guy once you got to know him. Holden mentions that Stradlater was the kind of guy that if you had mentioned how much you liked his tie, for instance, he would give it to you right then and there. Or the next day he'd have that tie on your pillow waiting for you. Ackley chimes in and says, yeah, if I had his kind of money, I'd do the same thing. But Holden says, no, you wouldn't. He says, actually, you'd be the most selfish son of a bitch there ever would be. At this moment, the door of the room flies open, and in comes Stradlater. He goes over to Holden and gives him a playful little slap on the cheek, and then immediately asks if he can borrow Holden's houndstooth jacket. Holden asks if the game is over and if they won, to which Stradlater says it's only halftime, but he's leaving. And he spilt something on his gray jacket, so he wants to know if he could borrow Holden's. Holden playfully says no, because I don't want you stretching out my jacket. Holden then goes on to describe Stradlater and his build, and how though they were the same height, Stradlater was actually about twice his size. At this point, Stradlater says hello to Ackley, and Ackley just kind of towards him, and then makes up some excuse and leaves the room, to which Holden is not mad about. Holden then reluctantly agrees to let Stradlater borrow his jacket. Stradlater takes off his tie and his shirt and says that he's going to go to the bathroom and trim his beard. Holden mentions that Stradlater likes to walk around shirtless because he believes he looks good, and Holden has to admit he does have a nice build. This is where Chapter 3 ends of Catcher in the Rye. Now, let's jump into Chapter 4. Chapter 4 starts out with Holden following Stradlater to the bathroom as he was shaving and getting ready. Holden mentions that he was whistling the Song of India while he shaved. He mentions Stradlater is a terrible whistler and could ruin pretty much any song that he whistles. He then goes on to say that Stradlater and Ackley did share one thing in common, and that is that they were both slobs. However, Stradlater was a different type of slob. Holden goes on to explain that Stradlater looked really nice from the outside and always kept his appearance, but the items in which he used to keep his appearance were always dirty. And Holden mentions the razor that he's using, how the razor was always full of hair and shaving cream, and how Stradlater never bothered to clean it, even though Stradlater always looked good. He also goes on to say Stradlater was a very handsome man, and he was the type of handsome that when parents looked in the yearbook, they always stopped and asked, who's this guy? Holden says he thinks there are other guys at Pensy that are much more handsome than Stradlater, but don't appear to seem so in a yearbook. As Stradlater is shaving, Holden is on the sink next to him in the bathroom, and they're having a conversation. Stradlater has asked Holden to write a composition for him, and Holden says, isn't it ironic that you realize I'm flunking out of this goddamn place, and yet you're asking me to write your goddamn composition? Stradlater says he understands, but he also knows Holden is a phenomenon in English. He says that if Holden can write this for him, he would really appreciate it. But also, don't write it really well. Make sure that there are still some mistakes, so that way it seems like Stradlater wrote it. This irritates Holden because Holden thinks that if he's going to do something, he should at least do it correctly. Holden asks what the composition is supposed to be about, and Stradlater basically says it can be about anything as long as it's descriptive, but primarily it needs to be about a room or a house. Holden then gets bored with the conversation, and Stradlater continues to groom himself. Holden pulls back and begins to start doing a small little tap dance and making fun of the musicals and follies that he knows. Stradlater begins to laugh at what Holden is doing, and this really eggs Holden on to continue. Holden then gives a little dramatic monologue which really gives Stradlater a kick. After this, Stradlater asks Holden about the hunting hat because he's never seen it before, and at this moment, Holden is out of breath from the tap dance, so he goes to the wash bin and tells him the story. Holden then asks if there's a girl downstairs waiting for him, and Stradlater says yes. He also asks if it's Fitzgerald. Stradlater says, nope, I am through with that pig, and Holden asks, well, How about giving her to me then? She's my type. Stradlater says, go ahead, take her, but she's probably too old for him. At that moment, and for really no reason except that Holden was in a mood, he began to horse around with Stradlater and puts him into a half Nelson. Holden goes on to explain that a half Nelson is a wrestling move where you get the guy's head around the neck and choke him to death, if you feel like it, of course. Stradlater tells Holden to cut it out, and that if he's not careful, he's going to cut himself with the razor. Holden doesn't let go and tells Stradlater to liberate himself from his vice grip. Stradlater puts down his razor, and with all of his strength, breaks out of the half Nelson and puts Holden down. After this, Stradlater goes back to shaving himself with the crappy razor. Holden asks if his date isn't Fitzgerald, then who is it? Is it Phyllis Smith? To which Stradlater says no, his date is actually Jane Gallagher. Holden goes, oh, I know her personally. Holden at that moment is struck speechless because he knows exactly who Jane Gallagher is. And he goes on to give Stradlater a little bit of history about how he knows her. He says that she practically lived the summer before last and she had a huge Doberman Pinscher. Holden then goes on to ask if she happens to go to BM or if she's going to Shipley. Stradlater says, I don't really know, and he doesn't really care. And do please get off his towel because he's trying to use it. Holden then gives Stradlater a little bit more information about Jane Gallagher and that she was a dancer and she loved ballet and she would practice for 2 hours every day, even in the hottest weather. He also goes on to say that they would play checkers all the time, and the one thing she would do is when she finally would get a king, she would line it up on the back row. But she would never use them. He then goes on to say that he used a caddy for her mother every once in a while because they were part of the same club. At this moment, Holden notices that Stradlater really isn't paying attention and is more concentrated on his looks. Holden says that he should go down and say hi to her, and Stradlater agrees. Then Holden goes into saying that her mother and her father were divorced, and that her mother remarried to some skinny guy who had very hairy legs and was a big boozer. Jane told Holden that he was supposed to be a playwright or something, but all he did was drink and listen to murder mysteries, and he would also run around the house naked. At the sound of that, Stradlater's ears perked up. Holden said that anything that had to do with sex or being sexy always perked up Stradlater's ears. Stradlater and Holden talk for a little bit longer while they're in the bathroom, and Holden goes on to ask Stradlater if she enjoyed the game, etc., etc. And he said he really didn't know or really cared. Holden asked if Stradlater could give her his regards, and please don't mention to her that he's failing out of Pensy. Stradlater agrees, but Holden knows he's really not going to say anything at all. Then they make their way back to the room where Stradlater is getting dressed and looking at himself in the mirror, making sure his hair is perfect. Stradlater asks Holden where his cigarettes are, and Holden answers that they're on the desk under the muffler. Stradlater finishes getting ready, puts the cigarette into the houndstooth jacket, and begins to move out of the room. Holden asks where they're going on their date, and Stradlater basically says he doesn't know. He says that she's only checked out until 9:30 that evening. Holden makes a joke and says that if Jane had known how handsome Stradlater was, she would have checked out for 9:30 in the morning. Stradlater gets a kick out of this and begins to laugh, and as he's opening the door, he looks back at Holden and says, remember the composition, and to finish it. And then he leaves the room. Holden says he sits there for about half an hour after Stradlater exits, sitting in the chair not really doing anything. He then keeps thinking about Jane and about Stradlater and her having a date. This kind of makes him nervous because he knows how sexy Stradlater is, but as he's thinking about this, Ackley barges back into the room, and for once Holden really isn't upset about this. Holden says that Ackley stays in the room with him until dinner time, and during this time Ackley talks about all the guys he hates and is popping his pimples at the same time. Holden wishes that Ackley had a handkerchief and that he could pop his pimples into that, but he knows for certain Ackley does not have one. This is where chapter 4 ends. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, stay lit.